How are you doing?
Not bad. Not bad. Hanging in there. It's been again an interesting time, for everybody. But just hanging out at the moment at my parents' place in this room, and um, kind of trying to stay busy, sort of, but also trying to use this time for reflection and I don't want to say meditation so much, but reflection.
Some of the other people I've talked with have kind of hinted that this has been a real impediment to motivation, particularly, for example, for practicing. Picking up an instrument isn't exactly what they want to do right now. Do you experience that?
Oh, absolutely. I think you get into a groove, and you get excited about a series of short-term goals or long-term goals. Whether it be learning all of the Beethoven quartets, which I was in the middle of, or yeah, picking up repertoire in order to play it in interesting parts of the world. And when that suddenly grinds to a halt, uh, you're sort of left not only having created this groove and sort of getting into a certain zone of learning things quickly, or being excited about the stuff that's just like coming at you. And when all of a sudden you're looking at all of this unstructured time, yeah, it's a huge gear shift. It's a huge change. And yeah, I think certainly the first week of this quarantine for me was sort of like, I guess I don't have to do that anymore. So, I mean, not to take it too lightly. I mean, it's devastating on a certain level, but it's also it's very strange to have this amount of time. I mean, it's almost like having a vacation in a weird way. And I know that's probably a horrible thing to say, considering how hard so many people are working, to combat this thing. And I'm doing my own part too, I think, but I'm not gonna. I can't. I'd be lying if I said it didn't come as a sort of welcome surprise to have this period of, okay, what am I going to do with myself? Which I hadn't afforded myself until this crisis.
Well, it's kind of like people who retire.
Yeah, sure.
How do you find meaningfulness outside of work? In some ways, retirement's even more complete because at least you'll be going back eventually, one way or another, to something similar to what you were doing before. Most people who retire don't really have that. They just kind of all of a sudden are faced with this huge amount of time and don't know how to fill it.
It's a good point you make. And yeah, I mean, I think yeah, when you have a bookend and a return at some point, I think that it makes for us maybe a somewhat more hopeful situation.
Right.
I'm sure once things clarify that, basically my identity as a violinist primarily will start to kick in again, and I'll start getting excited. I mean, it's not like I'm gonna not learn the stuff I needed to. I just I'll do it when it feels right.
Are you picking up your violin to practice?
Occasionally, yes. One of the structural things that I still am on a certain level obligated, but also am enjoying doing is teaching every Monday. So having at least that rhythm has given me some motivation in order to be prepared for my students and sort of walk down memory lane. When you're learning the great repertoire, oftentimes it's concertos and stuff that's technically challenging. So I was looking at the last movement of Mozart 5 and the last movement of the Bruch Concerto, and sort of reminding myself of the level of difficulty of some of these pieces, but also, enjoying sort of running through these passages, through my fingers. So I even broke a string, which was very dramatic.
There you go.
So yeah, it's been fun. But I feel like I think because I don't have the pressure, that I can pick up the fiddle on my own terms, which is, I don't know, satisfying somehow.
It's not that you are obligated to do it because of some time crunch, but rather because you want to.
Yeah, so it's freeing.
The other thing we talked about was your compositions. You had sent me your piano trio, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
Thank you. I've coerced some of my friends into playing my music now, and I'm being ironic, but they seem to actually enjoy it, which is gratifying. Of course, I think there are different motivations for composers. Some people want to show off their intellectual capacity and their range of whatever, and I'm finding that if I am inspired to write something, it's for a particular purpose. So if there's anything that's good or inspirational that comes out of these pieces, it's kind of a function of who they were written for or why they were written. So I have these duos that I wrote for violin and cello, and that had to do primarily with a gig that I had to play, and they asked for 18th century repertoire for violin and cello, which is a strange request because the 18th century doesn't have that repertoire. They have string trios, they have string quartets, and piano trios, but they don't have string duos,
Right.
Really. And I spent a lot of time on IMSLP and on the internet looking for these things. And yeah, I arranged, actually part of the gig was part of the fun part. A fun part of the gig was finding stuff that worked for violin and cello. But then I realized, what, this is an opportunity for me to explore kind of some model compositions and what could work in a kind of neoclassical way for that ensemble. So the piano trio came from a different set of motivators. I was at the Bellingham Music Festival, and I was staying at with a host family, and I had the afternoon free, and I sat down and I was saying, wow, I have all of this time. At that, an afternoon felt like an eternity. So in 3 or 4 hours, about 80% of this trio happened. And that's an interesting process because there was a lot of flow, and I didn't edit very much. And then I wrote a fifth movement because it felt right months later. And I think it works. I'm not really going for anything, but I think it is somewhat unique, and I'm kind of proud of it as almost like an opus one, Mm-hmm. And it surprises me, actually, having spent my entire performative life playing string quartets, that this is the medium, that I was drawn to. So it's I don't know. There's a certain amount of mystery to it, and I am understanding now why people go, "Oh, the muse has called me, on my cell phone."
Did your father, who happens to be a composer, has he given you feedback about it?
Yeah, he liked it. He was at the premiere, so the recording that you have, I think he appreciated some of the things I did. There's sort of this, I would say, disintegrating figure in the third movement, and I heard a chuckle from the audience, which I think was him. So I think he saw either the humor or the craft in it. So that's gratifying on a certain level. I mean, again, I can't claim to be a composer. I mean, I think that would be the height of hubris. Someone like my father does this every day, and has done it for nearly half a century. So for me, I'm coming at it from a very different place, and I think with very different motivations and for very different purposes.
What is your goal with it?
To make something that people can have an emotional reaction to, and to enjoy on some level, and to express something myself that I want people to hear. Hindsight's 2020 or not. And when I wrote it, it felt like an exercise for me. And then, the more I sort of lived with it before it was premiered, I think I started to my take on it changed. And then I think that was actually what helped propagate the fifth movement, because I realized that I had something I could say further in this format. So yeah, I mean, I'd be happy if other people played it, because I'd love for it to have a life outside of my head. And when you listen to MIDI all day, it's pretty debilitating. So also the only reason the premiere happened was really a domino effect of being offered a concert and then being given a certain amount of leeway to program it. So it was supposed to ostensibly be a violin and piano recital, and then I invited another performer, and that's where I realized, wow, this could be the premiere. So I'm glad to have done it myself, but as my father would tell you, playing your own music is some of the hardest thing, some of the hardest stuff to do. But I also think that's a great challenge. I think of some of the great composers in the canon, and they were, a lot of them, performer composers. So, I guess I'm exploring that.
Do you think the piece is done?
Well, I had a conversation with my cellist, who's a wonderful artist, and he's about 10 years my junior. And, he's not a composer. I mean, he hasn't actually done it in a disciplined sort of way. And he thought that it could stand to be edited. And actually, my father suggested that I lengthen the last movement. I think it's done. I think, the one thing everyone says is, the artist never knows when to stop. And there's so many things that are said about artists, and, I'm using these terms probably unfairly, but I think it's done. It has to do with who I was then. And if it has a life of its own, then I'm happy. But, that's a reflection of what I was going through or what I was experiencing. So, if I were to write something else, I think it wouldn't be an edit or a deepening of that expression. It would be something completely different.
So you're not a Bruckner who continually revisits and revisits?
Well, to be fair, I did add a little bit of a kind of tag between the fourth and the fifth movement, and I'd love to hear how that works in the context of it. And actually, to be fair, again, full disclosure, the day of the concert, because I was doing something a little bit, how the end, it sort of disappears or dissipates, and the idea, it's a little bit of a, as a musical gesture. And talking with the pianist at the time, we realized that bum ba bum as opposed to blah, 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 so there was an edit that happened. There were actually 2 or 3 edits that happened right before the premiere. So, there's always these little things that you can go back and kind of fix. But yeah, I don't know, Bruckner, it's interesting you mentioned Bruckner, because I think I have to owe this particular piece to having just performed the Fourth Symphony of his. So, and I'm not a huge Bruckner fan. I mean, if I'm going to listen to a long symphony, I'd much prefer to listen to Mahler or Shostakovich. But there was something about playing the Romantic Symphony that I think directly led to me composing this trio. So it's a mystery to me. If I knew, I would tell you.
Thank Anton.
Thanks, Anton. Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of his either. And speaking of editing, he's one of those composers, sort of like Elgar, who I think really needs a good editor.
That's interesting. Well, Elgar's an interesting figure because he didn't have formal training.
Mm-hmm.
And, I love a lot of his music. I mean, the Cello Concerto, I think, is a really profound piece and an unbelievably kind of vulnerable reaction to the devastation of World War I. I mean, again, I don't know why I feel like I need to put things in context, but having gone through the process now a few times myself, it's interesting for me in my own life to see, like, okay, what does this piece have to do with, and
Sure.
And on a certain level, that's a separate conversation. I mean, these pieces exist on their own.
What's interesting to me about those 2 composers is they compose really long symphonies.
Sure.
And when you're in the middle of them, it seems doubly long, at least for me as a listener. And to me, they could have benefited from some focusing and a little red pen to get rid of section. But hey, here I am, a non-musician, passing judgment on. But nevertheless, it does get to the point of how difficult it is to self-edit and to know when something is finished. I happen to paint
Yes, I know.
And somebody says, well,
Yeah.
how do you know when it's done? Well, I just do.
Hmm.
I mean, I don't think about it. It's just done. It looks good to me, so it's done.
And that brings up a good point. I mean, the artist, I think, is often called on to justify their work, and I don't think an artist needs to. That's the job of an art historian or a musicologist. I mean, that's that discipline, But and then of course, I don't know. Maybe people think that that's irresponsible or something. Like you should be held accountable, but a lot of it is intuitive. It felt right, it looked right, and there it is.
Well, aren't you really held accountable by whether people want to hear it after they heard it one time?
That's a good point. Yes and no. Then that brings up questions of why do we have the canon? Why do we sort of force this stuff that's difficult or not easy to apprehend on a first listen on people? Well, because there's more to be mined for it, I think is the hope. So even stuff that's really hard to perform or really hard to listen to, some of Schoenberg's very complicated works, I'm thinking of Everartung, for example, that's an unbelievable piece. It's really hard to do, or his the Fantasy for violin and piano. These are great pieces, but they require a lot of investment on both the artist and the audience. So I don't know if it's a good measure. I think superficially, sure. If things get played a lot, then it means that they have some value. But I also think things can be overplayed. I mean, think of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Do we really need to hear it again?
Geez, do I ever need to hear a Tchaikovsky's Fifth again? I don't think ever.
Well, and here's the thing, and here I love Tchaik 5. I think it's great. I love all of the symphonies. I haven't listened to it on repeat, so maybe I'm not yet jaded. Here I am. I'm going to be playing all of the Beethoven quartets at some point, in a cycle, and that's an incredible sort of milestone for any string quartet player. Do we need to do that? Is it a necessary thing, or has it become this sort of like rite of passage on a certain level? Does it come at the expense of giving newer voices some play? And I don't know, I don't have answers to that question.
But on the other hand, people do love the Beethoven quartets.
Yeah, they happen to be some of the best ever written. So
and people go and fill up seats, which to some degree is a measure of how good a work is. But I agree with not necessarily. They're bad works that fill seats.
True, but there's an aspect of community and ritual, and these, especially when you're talking about really famous composers that have been around for a while and sort of enshrined in this idea of sort of worship. It starts to become a more culturally diffuse thing. It's less about the work itself; it's about so much more. Well, and a touchstone, like a touchstone. The other day we were talking about Winterreise and Der Lindenbaum. That's a song that has resonance far beyond, I think, even what Schubert probably intended in 1827. A whole thesis could be written on that. So yeah, I think something like the Beethoven quartets or the Bruckner symphonies, for those who are really into them, end up gaining this sort of extra musical significance.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it becomes a cultural phenomenon, sometimes bigger than music itself.
Oh yeah, almost certainly. Yeah.
A few weeks ago at the Atlanta Symphony, they played all Scandinavian music, which was really interesting because in general, our concert halls aren't full of Scandinavian. You hear Grieg every so often, but you don't go much beyond that, which is kind of interesting. Talking about it's just doesn't seem to be part of the classical music concert. Maybe because it was too far north and too cold. And I don't know. I don't know.
It's so interesting you say that. I have a lot of friends who ended up doing schooling and are working in Finland particularly. And it strikes me that there's an incredible appreciation for classical music, however complicated that term is, over there. And I think there's sort of been, I don't know if it's like a renaissance, but there's certainly been an incredible amount of activity particularly in Finland, but in Scandinavia, as you were saying, Denmark, Sweden, Norway. Yeah, I mean, it's a. I think they're having a good time over there playing a lot of classical music, and they're doing a fantastic job. So yeah, I don't know. The United States is weird as a country and as consumers of art. It's a strange place for sure.
Yeah, it is. It is, and maybe it's a function of the way arts get funded here to some degree.
Oh, sure, absolutely. I mean,
it does become a popularity contest.
Yes, and when you're dealing with very limited funds.
I was speaking with Michael Kurth last night. Do you know Michael?
Of course, yeah.
And we were talking about does the programming of contemporary music tamp down the number of people who go to a concert? And I've seen studies in the past that say that's not true, that in fact audiences go up when you add in contemporary music. And he said that their experience in Atlanta is in fact that when you do something contemporary, you have better turnout, which is really counterintuitive to me.
Interesting. Well, and I wonder if it's not only a numbers thing, but maybe it's the demographics of the audience that also changes.
Could be.
If it's an increase in actual just number of people there, that's great. But I also think new music brings different people. I think there are, people go to concerts, go to the symphony for a variety of different reasons. And I think, your core subscribers may go because they want to hear their favorites. And I think, certainly from a programming standpoint, I think new music is seen as a risk because it's new. No one knows what it is. And I think that creates a certain amount of anxiety for some people. Then there are the other people that really dig that new experience. Is this going to be great? Is it going to be terrible? Am I going to love it? Am I going to hate it? And so, yeah, it's a somewhat more a dynamic situation. But yeah, you'd have to talk to a marketing person about the numbers. I don't have there.
But it would be a hopeful sign if it were true.
Sure. Well, that's encouraging to hear. And I know Bob Fano in his 20 years there has made an impact and has certainly, put his weight behind new music. And I think it's really amazing. Mike Kurth is a great example. He's been performed by the Atlanta Symphony and you look at the resume, he's just a bass player. But of course, he's so much more than that, and he's a great composer. And I think it's wonderful that he's recognized for that.
Right.
By the organization. So.
Right. The other thing I'll say about Spano with his Atlanta School of Composers, they're what I call listenable composers. They never shock you. Sometimes they may not be interesting, but some of them produce some really stellar music. It doesn't take repeat hearings in order to grab a hold of. There's not a lot of really, however you want to define it, far out stuff. Oftentimes, and we talked about this the other day, on Slip Disc, a lot of people talk about how actually new music is anti-music and anti-melody and all the other kinds of antis, but they must be listening to the wrong stuff.
Again, it's hard for me to sort of make a value judgment on that. I mean, I think any music can be appreciated for, a variety of different reasons. And I think that certain music is created for certain purposes, and I think, yeah, if you want to be immediately attractive, there are a number of sort of value systems that one can use in order to ensure that. Tonality is one of them. Melody, as we were saying the other day, is possibly another. But then you're dealing with value systems that do have a lot of historical example and oftentimes examples of great masterpieces. So I think in the mid 20th century in the States, this desire to be not necessarily more mathematical, but certainly more process oriented. Turned a lot of people off.
Right.
And because it was difficult, because it was, as you say, maybe slightly less listenable.
Right.
I think, we're in this kind of interesting era where, that's perhaps no longer the case. Those value systems have either changed or been sort of reintegrated into something that's perhaps a little more holistic. And I think what puts the lie to all of this sort of rumination is the notion of film. And I think that dissonance in the context of film is much more accepted by the listener / viewer because it relates or doesn't to something that's happening on the screen. So, you think of a lot of the composers that were hanging out in Hollywood, a lot that came from the Central European tradition, they knew their Schoenberg, they knew their Weber, and they knew their Baer, Bartok too. And you think of Stravinsky and Schoenberg hanging out in L.A. Of even, the Bernard Herrmanns or the Korngolds or the Eric Zeisels, these guys that were, totally at home in these less attractive, quote unquote, ways of writing music. And when you associate it with an image, the viewer, the listener, they dig it, they get it. If you tried the same thing without the image in a concert hall, would it be received differently? I venture to say yes.
I agree with that, because when you're watching a movie, your head's divided between the auditory and the visual, as well as the processing of it. But I don't think any of us watch a movie focusing solely on the music.
No, I don't know. Now I'm thinking about it. It's hard to put in the words, but it's at once more immediate, but also less focused.
Because you got to keep in mind plot, characters, action on the screen, things that are happening in the visual cortex as opposed to the auditory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. So you get the sort of feedback loop. Is the music, saying something different, or is it reinforcing what's happening on screen?
Right. And I think we talked the other day on John Williams was in Atlanta, and they did Indiana Jones, a scene from there with both music and the video. Then they played the video only, and then they played the music. And really, it's a lot better when it's together.
It means that the film composer's done a good job.
Exactly. And that, I think, was his point. So any plans for this week? Or is it just one more week?
It's a little bit one more week. I mean, the other thing that's given me a sense of meaning, for lack of a better word, is this fund that we've set up for Philadelphia musicians. So we're raising, our goal is to raise $100,000, and there's a committee of 7 people that are, helping to decide, who gets money and stuff. So we've been really working hard on that, and I've been learning a lot about parliamentary procedure and how democracy works and how you can be an asset to your community.
Is there a website associated with that?
Sure. Well, if you search on GoFundMe, it's the Philadelphia Area Musicians Relief Fund. Another cool thing is we're aligning with the Philadelphia Virtual Music Festival. That's festival with a PH. And people are putting on concerts from their living rooms and broadcasting them. And that's been a great way of calling attention to the fund, but also kind of keeping something fairly regularly happening musically so that people can tune in. And that's been great. I think it's 2 or 3 times a week where people are, we've had people from the Philadelphia Orchestra, we've had singer-songwriters, we've had jazz pianists, we've had, I think, a Baroque ensemble just last week. So it's been a real variety of people from the Philly area. So it's been a really cool project to be a part of.
Are you going to play?
Me?
Yeah, from your
probably
living
room? Not. I've put up my own stuff, which has been fun, but I haven't gotten to that point yet.
All right, I've kept you long enough.
It's a pleasure to talk with you again, William.
Yeah, it's always fun to talk with you. Again, regards to your dad.
Absolutely. Check it out.
Bye.